to the fourth in a series of these drought webinars for the Great Plains and the Midwest. I wish we were here to say things other than what we're probably going to say, because the situation, if you've looked at the latest drought monitor map, which we'll be showing here later, certainly hasn't gotten a lot better. So thank you for being on the call, and we look forward to your questions. The only other thing I'll say is before I turn it over is that we very much welcome your feedback on these drought webinars. So if you want to drop me a line or Dennis, we would be more than happy to hear how you use this information, if you use this information, and whether you think these are useful to you in the work that you do and decisions that you make. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Dennis Toddy, who happens to be the state climatologist in South Dakota. This is his second one of these. So at this point, Dennis, please take it away. And thank you.
All right. Thank you, Doug, and welcome everyone. Yes, we have some, I wish we had great news to give people. There's maybe a little bit of good news, but not a ton of good news to tell people about, so we'll talk about that as we go along here. We would like to welcome you to this. This is a single-person webinar who are presenting these, but it is compiling the work of several different partners. You see a number of them below from NOAA, National Weather Service, Regional Climate Centers, National Drought Mitigation Center, state climatologists, with also information used from USDA, USGS, and a number of other partners. So we do want to highlight that idea of partnership between federal and state entities, and that is in play here. Taking this time to talk a little bit more about an overview of what's happening in the climate situation, where we can look for in the coming months, and just give people an idea of what we're going to see going ahead here. Again, the partners, specific partners involved, you'll see here, and their positions. There are a number of people who have contributed to this. We're going to continue to do these. The next one of these that we are planning on is, it will be 3 weeks before the next one. We'll do September 6th, also a Thursday at 1 p.m. The host of this one is still to be determined. We hope to maybe do a little focus on some of the wildlife issues with the next one, plus update any other further information related to that. The webinar and information, these will be recorded and posted along with the slides at the URLs listed there at the High Plains and the Midwest Regional Climate Centers. So we invite you to review them, pass them on to people, use them however you see fit. But again, I would echo what Doug said. Please do pass on information to us on how you are using this, because it helps us to refine and pass on information that people are finding useful. Hopefully within the webinar recording will be available in the next 1 to 2 days. And at the end, again, we will have a question and answer. So please hold your questions till the end. We will deal with them at that point. Structure of the webinar is similar to previous ones, kind of give an update on current conditions. Again, a little more historical context, lots of historical context here, and none of it good, unfortunately, in what we're looking at. Talk about some of the current impacts with the current predictions. Today was a big day release with the release of the new drought monitor, the new drought outlook, and the CPC long-range outlooks, and then we'll take care of questions at the end of it. Picture here, again, from South Dakota, like the corn in the first one. Here we're seeing cracks in South Dakota soil, not a common thing that you see here. Okay, some main points to get at here are that the situation obviously is really unchanged, still very dry. Some precipitation in isolated areas has improved the drought monitor situation in a couple areas. Some places have seen some worsening. We have had a pattern change in that we've broken down the ridge across the middle part of the country a bit and allowing some cooler conditions, which would have helped us a lot sooner, but it's still welcome at this point. Right now, in the way of precipitation, no major changes in the way of precipitation just yet. Obviously, still setting many records for temperature and precipitation. The ag impacts are very large, and the environmental impacts are starting to show up now. We'll talk about that just briefly later on. As we look ahead at what may be happening in the next 30 to 90 days, the outlooks are that still continuing warmer than average is the most likely from the Climate Prediction Center. In the near term, again, these cooler conditions will prevail, but we will get a return to some warmer temperatures, likely through 30-day and likely the 90-day, and we'll talk about later. Right now, no major precipitation changes. We'll talk about that as we go on. There will become more precipitation as we go along, and how that will impact us we'll talk a little bit more about. Drought conditions are likely going to stay with us as we head into the fall. Some reductions, when we're talking about improvement in areas, is probably going to be likely, but likely will not be enough to resolve situations. We'll probably see some reduction in drought monitor levels. And then also we'll talk about El Nino and what it means for our future outlooks. Just some more review of the current situation going back to July on the left-hand side and May through July on the right-hand side. These are statewide ranks of temperature and where they rank on the 118 years of data available. For July, you see that most places were in the much above normal, near record high temperatures. You'll note that only one state, Virginia, did set their record high temperature for the month of July, but many states were the top few. If we look at the May through July period, the last 90 days, you see a very similar situation where we have top 3 or so, top 2 to 3 record May through July period. Colorado was the only one that set the record for this period. NOAA put a release out that July was the warmest July since 1934. So it was, we're talking about Dust Bowl comparisons here. That's not a good situation to be in. Other years that would be comparable, it would be 1936. A lot of the records set around the Plains area from July go to 1936. Also some from 88 and 1980. Another measure of what's going on in the way of temperature, this is a map from the USDA Office of the Chief Economist, the World Agricultural Outlook Board. They create a lot of information related to weather and climate impacts on ag production. This is the most recent map they put out on number of 100-degree days at or above 100 degrees from June to August. And you see the scale down there with the number of 100 days over 100 with the gray areas with 12 or more. So you can see the core of where the hottest temperatures have been over the longest period of time over the last couple months. It is interesting to note that the number of these days that went above 100 still stayed for the most part just south or right at the south edge of the main part of the Corn Belt. We had plenty of warm days across the Corn Belt, but the largest number of 100-degree days stayed just south. And this has kind of been in contrast with the trend that we have seen over the last probably 20 years or so, where we've had some not quite as warm temperatures over the Corn Belt states during the summertime. So the temperatures we have seen really do kind of stick out climatologically over the last 20 or 30 years. Another couple interesting features about this, you'll notice an area in Nebraska that had fewer 100-degree days. This is attributed to irrigation, the large amount of irrigation that occurs in Nebraska, reducing the high temperatures slightly. And then also there's a feature in western Iowa where that's a little bit higher elevation area in Iowa that maybe didn't quite as warm. From a record standpoint, any way you slice them, when you're looking at July, the last 3 months, a good portion of since the beginning of the year, there are plenty of records to be had. Daily record highs, monthly record highs, number of days above 100. So there's plenty of comparisons to be had there. Looking at precipitation, some context on precipitation. July, again, statewide ranks on the left-hand side, ranking from the 118 years worth of data. The oranges is much below normal precipitation, and the ranking scale 1 would be the driest on record. So you see several states right in the main core of the Corn Belt, top 5, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois. 9th all-time in Missouri, and then some other states surrounding them in the top 20 to 25 or so. So right in the core area. But you notice right outside that main core area we had some record wetness to our south, and to our east, and off to our west. So it's very interesting, the core amount that happened right over us. If we subdivide that down into climate divisions, each state is divided up into climate divisions. Those are depicted on the map on the right-hand side. You see particularly where the core or the driest areas were, and you see record driest climate divisions in eastern Nebraska, west central Iowa, with a number much below normals around them. So some really critical precipitation amounts during the month of July specifically. If we went back, we could go back and include previous months that would also set those kinds of records. Looking at soil moisture amounts, again, this is a major issue related to the crop production issues that we are seeing. We would love to have larger networks measuring soil moisture in the ground. Unfortunately, we do not have such a thing, so we're forced to rely on models, large-scale models of what's going on. The two maps that we're showing you on the right-hand side is the anomaly or deviation from average for early August, and the scale there is in millimeters, so you divide by about 25 to get inches. So the 100 would divide down into about 4 inches. So the areas of the main part of the Corn Belt, we're talking from 4 to 6 inches or more below average for this time of year. And then even outside that area, deviations below average are very clear. So that kind of gives you an idea of how much moisture we have to make up or put back into the soil as we get back to next year. We'll talk about that in the outlook coming up. To accompany this and put some historical perspective on this, on the left-hand side, we have the percentile ranking of the soil moisture for this same time period. And percentile is basically a ranking scale so that the redder you are, the higher you, or the lower you are on the scale. Basically, if you are at 1, a level of 1 on there, you'd be the driest on record. Or if you were out on the blue, you'd be the wettest on record. You see very little wet across the country, but lots of dry over the middle part. And that lots of dry is either in the 5th percentile or below the second percentile, which would be the top, driest 5 years, or as much as the driest 1 to 2 years on record, putting this in some kind of historical context. And I believe that's all we needed to talk about there. Okay. Going on to the next one, another issue related to some of the current climate conditions going on, large fires going on. We have been, for the most part, lucky across the central region of the U.S., the Great Plains, and the Midwest, that we've not had as many large fires. This is from the USDA Forest Service, an active fire mapping plotting scheme. And what we have going on, I've highlighted 2 areas that are part of or close to the central region and areas of large fire. One is to the south, getting into southeastern Kansas, parts of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, where we have fires going on as of this morning. And then as we get larger number of fires out to the west, a few of those get over into the plains areas, Wyoming, and parts of Montana. There have been other fires that have occurred across the plains because of the dry conditions, grassland fires. Most of those have been able to be brought under control in relatively short order. Northern Nebraska had one that extended for a couple weeks earlier in July. Unfortunately, fires probably are going to continue to be an issue with us as we go on. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Okay, looking at some of the crop conditions, we got a few plots here. This one is a bit detailed, but it has lots of good information. This is a couple weeks old. What this shows is each state is each bar. You can see across the bottom, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, etc. And then the scale adds up to 100%, and we're breaking down the crop conditions in each state, ranging from excellent, which is the green part at the top, to good, which is the light green part, the next step down, or yellow, which is fair, the orangish tannish color, which is poor, or red, very poor. So you break down each state, the numbers have to add to 100, and then breaks down by scale of what the crop conditions are like. And you can see kind of a sets based on different states and where they are. Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky are the worst, with the highest percentages of corn crop, and this is corn crop in poor to very poor, ranging from 70 to 80% plus. The next set would probably be Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, which are closer to 50% of corn poor to very poor. And then you have Minnesota, which is probably the best off of any of them, with only a small part of the corn in bad condition and actually about 10% in very good condition. So that's kind of a breakdown on what's happening in each one of these states. The latest projections have come out for corn yield for the U.S., and kind of putting some perspective on this, these are also taken from the USDA Office of the Chief Economist, plotting the U.S. corn yield. The scale is in bushels per acre, and the trend over time, and you can see what is projected for this year. Quite a drop off from where we have been even last year, but then 2 years ago, projected as 123.4 bushels per acre. That is the lowest since the mid-90s, really. So showing you how historically bad this crop is projected to be. And that is related to, on the bottom, you see the total percent of the corn crop across the Midwest that's in poor to very poor conditions. We have about 50% in poor to very poor. That is the worst since 1988, the last major drought we have had across the country. Across the Corn Belt. Soybean projection, similar thing. The amount that's in poor to very poor, is on the order of 39%. Soybeans are a little more forgiving. We are getting to the point during the year where there's very little time for them to show much recovery, and probably too late for too much recovery, but additional precipitation can help them get through. This U.S. soybean acreage, or soybean bushels per acre, is projected at 36.1, which would be the lowest since looks like 2003 or 2004. Can't quite read that. Okay, the other part of the ag parts of it, crop reports on range of pasture land and poor and very poor condition, similar to what we saw for the corn ones, but this goes by on a statewide basis, showing where they are right now. And this is, you can see again those same areas, greater than 90%, nearly all of pasture land in Missouri, poor and very poor conditions, and well into the 80s are bound outside that. Okay, current U.S. drought monitor map for the country. Again, this is just released this morning. Again, the scope of how much of the country is involved in this drought is quite impressive. Currently, 70% of the continental U.S. is some coverage on the map, and 62% is D1 or worse, D1 to D4. In contrast to last year, where much of the drought issues were confined to the southern U.S., very bad, but mostly confined, we have a much wider scale drought going on this year. We zoom this up into the Midwest and Great Plains region. Again, just released this morning. You see the ongoing large area of D3, D4. We actually had a little bit of increase in coverage in the D3 to D4, mainly D4, conversion of D3 to D4, where we added about 5% from just under 7 to just under 12% that is covered in D4. D3 dropped slightly, and there was actually a little bit of reduction in the D0 and D1, with some areas receiving a little bit of precipitation, the eastern part of the Corn Belt, so some reduction. But overall, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska are the bulk areas that have the D4 condition going on. Other impacts not touched on here. We touched on the ag impacts. We hope to cover more is fish kills in several states. It seems mainly related to water temperatures, but widespread numbers of fish kills, and some large ones in several areas. Because of the reduction in yield potential this year, commodity prices have seen major skyrocketing, setting record highs on corn. A lot of corn has been chopped already for silage, so places where we would have still actively growing corn, there is nothing going on right now. It's going to change our conditions at the surface probably this year compared to other ones. Still numerous fires, mostly in western areas, even though we have to do some grassland areas around us. More widespread watering restrictions. Because of the ongoing dryness now, The wetter period we've come out of has been, seeing those access to water reduced, so we're seeing watering restrictions in more cities. And in some places we have wells going dry. Saw reports over in Indiana where we had some shallower wells going dry, seemingly due to irrigation pulling out of that well and other areas. Okay, that kind of gives you a status on the current conditions. We're going to go ahead and look at what the outlooks are saying now. Look out for 2 weeks in the 8 to 14-day period, September to November, and then we're going to also talk a little bit about El Nino and talk about the drought monitor outlook. The first thing to talk about is the resurgence of El Nino. This is not the complete driver of everything, but it does help give us some long-range capability. So what we're showing you here is a sea surface temperature loop. Sea surface temperature normally differs from average. The scale is on the right-hand side. The warmer areas are in the redishes, the brown to reddish, and this is in degrees C, so you multiply by about 2 to get degrees Fahrenheit. You see an enlarging area of warmer than average water off the coast of South America and Central Pacific. That is indicative of a resurging El Nino, which is likely to be happening this fall. It is projected to be a weak to moderate one, not a major event, but it will help to give us some pieces of information as we go along. What that can mean for us as we go into the fall, we're showing you here, this is the El Nino signal for precipitation, and the years that are included in the bottom, and this is September and November, years are included at the bottom, and we're going to focus on the map on the left-hand side. The areas in green are areas of increased precipitation, and the areas of brown see a bit of decreased precipitation during El Nino. So this is all thrown together regardless of strength. So you can see that the plains area and in the farther east areas have a better chance of seeing a little bit above average precipitation based on the El Nino signal. You can see a little bit in eastern Iowa up into the Great Lakes, maybe a lesser chance of precipitation during these events. Again, each one is a little bit differently. We're looking at a composite of several different El Ninos. Okay, let's go ahead and look at what the outlooks are saying specifically. The 2-week outlook, this was issued yesterday, and new one will be coming out within the hour here. Temperature probability on the left-hand side, the blue area showing increased chances for cooler than average temperatures over the plains area and part of the Midwest. Again, we've had this pattern change where this ridge over the middle part of the country has shifted westward or retrograded. So we're seeing above average temperatures over the mountain areas, intermountain areas, while we're allowing some cooler air or near normal temperature air in the eastern Corn Belt to cover the area, it looks like, for a good portion of the rest of August. From a precipitation standpoint, you see that drier than average is likely in our western areas, near normal likely, except for the east, which is going to see a better chance for above average precipitation. As that ridge moves further west, it's going to be bringing more Canadian air down, which is cooler, but also doesn't have as much moisture available with it. So the eastern U.S., where we can get some resurgence of Gulf moisture, is where we can see better chances for precipitation. The new outlook for September, starting June 1, this would come at the end of that 2-week period we just looked at. CPC has backed off on the strength, but still saying above average temperatures throughout most of the country are most likely throughout the month of September. I think they're saying that the dry soil moisture conditions, we have crops that are going to be done earlier and done growing earlier, so they're not going to be helping keep the temperatures cooler at the surface. So likely still above average temperatures as we go on in September. And then over the main part of the Midwest, decreased chances for precipitation continuing. We will, I think, start seeing a transition to fall-type events as we go on here, but CPC is thinking we're still going to be on the dry side in the main part of the Corn Belt. The 3-month outlook stays with the warmer than average, even getting a little more bullish with warmer than average temperatures around the Great Lakes and up in the Northeast. I think this begins to become related to El Nino as El Nino strengthens later in the fall and the winter. That is a typical condition for El Nino, warmer than average temperatures, especially further north. You'll notice a conspicuous EC or the white area, really no strong indications on precipitation. CPC doesn't think that the El Nino is going to be strong enough to follow along some of the trends that we showed you on that earlier slide. So overall, they're going towards EC, or equal chances for a below or above average precipitation September through November period. Bringing that all together, what does that mean in the drought outlook? Showing you here, there have been a few changes this time around. We're looking at what's, from now through the end of November, what is likely to happen. The green areas here indicate best chances are improvement. These are places where the drought condition is not quite as bad. Chances for precipitation must be better at this point. The author thinks to be able to show improvement in these areas. Bounded along that in the hatched area is ongoing, but some improvement. I think this is likely to be the case on a larger scale, where we see some improvement overall with the fall, with cooler overall conditions, and probably a return of some moisture that we will start resolving some of the drought issues, but not overall removing drought issues in many places. I think that's going to be a wider spread basis. And in the brown area is large-scale persistence of the drought, where the issues are pretty serious. A lot of these get back to what the impact is. We can start recharging soil moisture for next year, but a larger part of the issues are surface water, especially for cattle in the plains areas. It's going to take a large amount of precipitation to start refilling some stock ponds to be able to resolve some of those issues. To kind of give you a little more perspective on what we could get, since we're not giving you indications for amounts of precipitation per se. This is from the High Plains Regional Climate Center, and the scale here, this is normal or average fall precipitation in inches, ranging from less than 3 inches in our far western areas to 3 to 5 over the Dakotas down to western Kansas, and then up to over 11 inches in our southern area. Now, what this means is that's how much we get on average in September to November, how much that we can use to help recharge soil moisture. If we consider that maybe about 75% or about 3/4 of rainfall can go to refilling soil moisture, that can give you an idea how much we can refill that soil moisture profile. So if you're down 6 or 8 inches or something like that in your soil moisture profile, you have a chance of recovering a decent amount of that this fall if we get near average precipitation. But that recharge capability is certainly a large function of rainfall rate, total amounts. Obviously, if you get less precipitation, most of it will run in versus very heavy precipitation amounts. So obviously your mileage may vary, but we have a decent chance of at least starting the recovery, likely not refilling the whole soil moisture profile. A few other pieces of information as we look ahead for the fall. Other pieces, early freeze issues. We would often get concerned about concern for early freeze. That's not going to be an issue this fall, at least from a row crop standpoint. Most of the corn is either been chopped for silage or is well ahead. Numbers we've seen are indicating this is the earliest corn dent on record, 2 to 3 weeks ahead, so that most of the crop growing and soybeans probably are going to be done by the time we even get to start considering chances for early freeze, even in the northern corn belt areas. So that's not going to be a problem. Soybeans have a little chance for maybe getting some moisture to help fill pods. Probably not much recovery at this point. We're pretty close to being where we're going to be. Some fall recovery will happen in the way of soil moisture, simply because with cooler temperatures we reduce the amount of crop water use. Plants grow actively less, so there's less withdrawal of moisture from the soil, so what goes in can stay there till the fall. Full recharge of a lot of soil moisture profiles is not likely, except for maybe some of the southern and eastern areas where average precipitation is a little bit higher. Fires could still be an issue this fall, basically because of, again, that early maturing, and then crops that are already done and dried out at this point. Those sitting there longer are going to be more of a fire risk as we go along in the fall, and without a return to getting some moisture in the area, the dry conditions could cause problems. Okay, just kind of a rehash then on where we are right now. Again, still dry, a little bit of a short-term pattern change, but fall, even though we're going to be warmer than average, we'll still be somewhat cooler than we have been. Ag impacts, environmental impacts, and then probably the take-home message is drought conditions are probably going to stay with us on the large scale. Some reductions are likely, and some improvement, but I don't see overall, great large-scale improvement in drought conditions. Okay, who are the people behind this, and where can you find more information? The top two links are where this presentation will be placed in the next day or two. Data comes from National Climatic Data Center, the Climate Prediction Center, Climate Portal, Drought Portal, National Drought Mitigation Center, state climatologists, and regional climate centers have all contributed time or efforts or data into this. Okay, that wraps up the main part of this. These are the thank yous. These are the people behind a lot of this and who you can go to for additional information. And again, as we said earlier, we would like to hear how you use this. Even if it's just, this gives me an update and knows where it is, that's good to know. Even better is we've made a decision or we're making decisions based on information passed on from this. Or even we pass this on to someone else so they can see it. That's good to know for us. Okay, at this point we will open it up for questions from anyone that is in attendance.
At this time, I'd like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Your first question comes from the line of Bryce Anderson. Your line is open.
Dennis, good afternoon.
Hi, Bryce.
Hey, good to hear you today. Great job. One of the private consultants out there earlier this week said that, in his view, the Pacific was actually kind of throwing a weak El Nino signal to the point that he thought that the Pacific could actually slip back into La Nina later this fall. Do you have any comments on that, please?
Certainly nobody is jumping up and down about this El Nino. I didn't show the plume of different models. There's a plume of different models that show what the sea surface temperature forecasts are for those. None of them are going more than moderate. A lot of them were quite weak or even marginal in the El Nino. So it could be questionable how good it will be questionable how good an El Nino this will be. I don't think we're going to slip back into La Nina. That was discussed earlier about there was this opportunity to slip back, but I think we've gone far enough at this point that we're probably not likely to slip back in La Nina. Probably the worst case scenario would be slipping back into just neutral conditions. And I guess I will modify that. The thing I didn't put into that was that there are other pieces that modify, especially as we get into wintertime, what can happen. Wintertime El Ninos tend to be warmer than average over the northern plains, Great Lakes. We have seen several examples recently where the Arctic oscillation or other impacts modify the El Nino signal. So those are things we'll have to watch very closely.
Your next question comes from the line of Janice Mogan. Your line is open.
My question was answered. Thank you.
You're welcome.
As a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Your next question comes from the line of Tim Kotza. Your line is open.
Yes, thank you. In our last gathering, or the last report, there was some mention made about stream flow reductions, and then that being the next shoe that was going to fall. And I guess, is there someone that could say something about the impacts on stream flow, and then the impacts that might have on drinking water supplies, fisheries, and so on?
I don't believe we have, unless someone is in the audience from, say, the River Forecast Centers or USGS, that we are right, that we've really seen no changes, nothing to improve overall conditions. Rivers, like the main stem of the Missouri, has been well fed, so it's been able to maintain. The Mississippi is having some issues being maintained, and then lots of smaller streams that feed cities. That's what leads into the water restrictions. We saw earlier that some of these stream flows have been dropping. Personally driving around, I've seen a number of streams that have typically been flowing this time of year are completely dry for this time of year, which is not unheard of, but certainly well on the end of what we have seen recently. And you are right. Watering restrictions are being set in place in areas. We're seeing wells that are going dry. People are coming up dry on wells. And the low water levels have been causing some fish kills, large areas. I'm not sure if with other states, South Dakota has some rules about low water levels where they shut off other water withdrawals to maintain water levels for fish in the areas. And I would assume other states probably have similar things on certain places where there's other withdrawals.
Thank you.
Dennis, what I'll add to that, this is Doug again from NOAA. What I would add to that is, if that is a concern, we certainly can add that to this repertoire of information on the next time around, and probably should, since we're going to be starting to look at longer-term impacts, since agriculture is sort of done for the year for the most part in many ways. We need to start looking at some of the other longer-term impacts like you're talking about, which are very important. Thank you.
Right, and we hadn't seen as much of those yet because we had been coming out of a relatively wet period. This was a very dry stretch the last few months, but there were background flows that were keeping things going, and we've reached the end of a lot of those background flows, so it is starting to become a larger issue.
Your next question comes from the line of Paul Lapisto. Your line is open.
Thank you. Again, great job, guys. One question, and may be tough to answer, but several of the national forecasting centers are predicting a slightly above average or active level of tropical depressions, tropical storms, and or hurricanes. Could any of those impact particularly the precipitation amounts the upper Midwest could be getting this fall?
They could, if they come across the Gulf and then curve northward, northwestward, they could impact maybe southern parts of the Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, and could cause some recovery in those areas. The areas of the plains and the northern areas, I really don't see those as being a possible impact. I'm not familiar with potential paths this time of year. There are some folks who know a little more about that. We don't do it too much in South Dakota, so I don't know as well as what are the possibilities of getting any kind of activity that would come across the Gulf and take the right path to do it, to cover for us.
Thanks.
Your next question comes from the line of a participant whose information has not been captured. Please provide your first and last name for the presenters. Your line is open. If you queued up for a question, your line is open.
Sally Johnson, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Sally Johnson, your line is open.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any comparisons to be made to the 1988 drought? I've had some questions on that here.
There was a release from out of Illinois, an agronomist out of Illinois compared the 88 drought, the impact on 88 drought to corn yields in that state. Percentage-wise, the reduction was not quite as serious in corn yields. The overall reduction in total yields is going to be larger than the 88 drought. So it kind of depends on how you want to do the comparison. I think the overall percentage impact on yields will be somewhat similar to what we saw during the 88 drought. So it's probably the best drought to compare to that is in recent memory. I mentioned, some other years that we're comparing to 1934 and 36 would be other comparison years, though there aren't many people around who can remember those. So 88 would probably be a reasonable comparison to do.
Dennis, this is Doug again. would you want to say a few words about, even though, you know, agricultural production has increased over the last, well, for almost forever, since the 30s anyway, the fact that we're having a degradation this year may have a larger impact due to the demand is also that much greater?
Well, certainly the yields, and that's a good point to bring up, Doug. One of the things I didn't put on there was one of the impacts. Well, I talked about commodity prices, you know, setting record corn prices because of this. Because of the widespread demand and use of corn and a variety of things regarding food, other products that are made, you know, this does have ripples throughout the economy. So this is going to, and ethanol, obviously, this is going to ripple through the economy. A lot of people blame ethanol for the whole thing and want the renewable fuel standard to be relaxed. You know, that's a political decision on what they want to do. A lot of what happens when corn gets this high a price, it does have some food impacts, but ethanol plants and some other things that use corn change direction. They either don't produce ethanol or they use something else or change just because they start losing money. So that's a widespread impact because of this. We can, you know, assuming we can get back to reasonable production levels next year, this should not be a major, I mean, it is big, but we can recover from it. If we were to have, you know, back-to-back yield loss years, and that's why we're watching soil moisture for the fall very closely. If we would have back-to-back bad years, that would, you know, that could really send a major issue throughout the economy.
Your next question comes from the line of Mary Knapp. Your line is open.
I wanted to make a couple of comments on the stream flow. I'm the state climatologist here in Kansas, and we've got record numbers of streams at their lowest level, so that's throughout the area. And the other thing was the chance of tropical systems making it up and relieving the rainfall. I went back and did a study of that, and out of the 100 or so years, there have been 4 where systems actually have made the way up into the plains in large enough amounts to make a difference.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate the input.
Your next question comes from the line of Bryce Anderson. Your line is open.
Yeah, Dennis, I had another question I wanted to mention as you're talking about the recovery from the drought possibility. One of our contributing analysts posted an article on our service where he looked at the 11 occurrences since 1895 when the Palmer Drought Index went into extreme drought category of minus 4.0 or below. And out of those 11 years, there was at least an 18-month, 15 to 20-month period where that it took to regain neutral. And then, of course, in the 1930s and then in the 1950s, that length of time was around 4 years. So is it possible that, you know, that we could be looking at over a year before this drought really is kind of taken care of, so to speak? What do you think?
I'm going to reserve judgment to see what happens this fall. I've not seen enough in the outlooks that makes me excited yet. If we are able to reduce soil moisture deficits down to, you know, even slightly below average this fall, I will feel better. If we continue with the dry conditions without much recovery, that will have me very concerned, and the ag community will also be very much taking note of that as we go into next year. Part of that, I wonder if, but the Palmer is that's the longer-term index, so I think it has a tendency to stay negative a little longer, even though short-term conditions can recover. I think that's the case, so there might be a little bit of that artifact in the analysis. But thanks for bringing that up. That's something we should watch very closely.
I don't want to scare people, but on the other hand, you know, that is a piece of research that's out there, and And when you say if dry conditions continue, it will be very much of a concern, do you mean using the drought monitor now, do you mean drought monitor levels at, say, D3 to D4, D2 to D4? Can you define that a little bit more?
I guess I don't have a defined number I'm thinking of, because I do think that we will probably notch down a number of those drought areas a level or two as the fall goes on, simply because most of the moisture that we're getting is going to be able to go into the soil and recharge soil moisture and not be reused again. So that will probably, and that with cooler conditions will probably ease some issues. So I mean, but anything that still stays in D2 this fall, I would have some concerns about, I guess. If you can get down in the D1 or D0 category, then you're probably in okay situations. Again, I would like a widespread network for soil moisture to be able to track soil moisture on a regular basis. You know, Nebraska does it. We're starting to do it in South Dakota. Oklahoma does it. Illinois does it. But you know, it's a disappointment that we can't do that on a widespread basis to be able to track where we are over time.
Okay, thank you.
We have no further questions at this time. I turn the call back over to the presenters.
Okay. Dennis, do you have any final words?
I think I've had plenty of time for words.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I just want to thank you, especially for your time and effort here. It was a very good presentation. We appreciate it very much. And like you say, the next one will be on September 6th. If you have any questions, further questions, comments, things you'd like to see added, I wrote a few notes down on stream flow, and perhaps even we do produce maps. There are maps out there that give some indication of how much rain is needed in certain periods to relieve the drought. They're probably not the most accurate in your backyard, but they're pretty broad scale. So, but they do exist, and we may throw some of those on the next presentation. So I want to thank you all who have stuck on here and listened to this and asked your questions. They were great questions. Thank you very much. And we will see you again on September 6th, same time. Thank you.
This concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.